Good evening, everyone. It's February 10, 2013. I'm Rene, and tonight we're going to be talking about the Invasion jailbreak. We're going to be talking about all the Apple rumors, iWatches, 5-inch iPhones, and less expensive iPhones. Oh my. We're also going to be talking about being stuck between Dropbox and iCloud. This is the iMore Show. Hey folks, I am back from Macworld. The show is back on schedule and we've got a lot to go over, so I'm going to jump right into it. First of all, the Invasion jailbreak has finally been released for iOS 6, iOS 6.1, the iPhone 5. Basically, if you want to jailbreak again, you can now go ahead and jailbreak. And it's been a while. There has not been a lot of jailbreak news for a good long time. So much, in fact, that I think a lot of people just sort of went along with their lives. You know, people who had older iPhones, maybe they didn't upgrade, but people who bought the iPhone 5 or the iPad mini or any new device that came running iOS 6, we kind of just went on with our lives. We didn't really think about it. I mean, I missed certain things. I've spoken about things like Byte SMS at length, but iOS had gotten to the point where it was good enough in enough areas that at least I didn't really stress about it, and I didn't hear a lot of people really stressing about it. But lo and behold, Invasion was released, and a lot of you went ahead and jailbroke. I mean, we did a poll on the site, and significantly more than half of you jailbroke within the first week at least. And that's fairly interesting, because as far as iOS 5 and iOS 6 came, including features like Notification Center that took a little bit of the stress off of using iOS for more advanced users, there was still all this pent-up interest. And if you look around, it's things like Zephyr, so you can use gestures on the iPhone instead of just on the iPad. It's things like 5 apps in the dock or 5 rows across of icons. All these little things that let people tweak and control their experience to a higher level, including up to theming, so you can change the general look, if not the structure, of iOS. Now, still, jailbreak certainly isn't for everyone. For a lot of people, using the default stock version of iOS is absolutely fine. But it's great that, once again, people who want to experiment, who want to try new things, who want to do specific things with iOS to match their use case and their needs, can now go ahead and do that. So if you have been jailbreaking, we have a ton of stuff on the site to show you how to if you're new to it. Or if you're not new to it, our jailbreak forums are exploding with activity. If you go to forums.imore.com, you can check in there, and everyone's discussing their favorite tweaks, their favorite themes, and more, that's what it's about. There's not so many apps anymore that the App Store doesn't take, but there's a lot of customizations that you can do. So check it out there. And if you are jailbroken, let us know what you're running, what caused you to want to jailbreak, and what you've done to your iPhone or your iPad to improve the experience. I'm really interested in finding out, because I have not yet jailbroken. I've become busy enough and satisfied enough that I haven't felt that pressure yet. I will probably jailbreak one of my devices just to play around with it, but combined with traveling and the iOS 6.1.1 beta, there's just been enough going on. I haven't tried it yet. So convince me. Tell me what I am missing and what I need to try out now, and I will absolutely appreciate it. So moving on, rumors. We are once again in silly rumor season. Apple released so many products last September and October, that it's hard to see exactly what they'll release this spring. Traditionally, they have a March event, and for the last couple of years, that's been the iPad event. Last year, it was the iPad 3 and the Apple TV, and this year, they've already released an iPad 4, and they did a stealth update for the Apple TV with a die-shrunk processor, and other minimal updates just to keep it current and maybe to test out some things for future products. So it's really unclear what Apple could show off in a March event, even if they decided to hold one. So of course, when there is an absence of real information, rumor runs rampant. And there's several things that are repeating themselves over and over again. Of course, before Apple released the iPhone, that's all everyone speculated about. Apple's making a phone. Apple's going to be putting out a phone. Then the minute Apple put out a phone, it was Apple's making a tablet. Apple's going to put out a tablet. And then the minute Apple put out a tablet, it became, oh, Apple is making a phone. Apple's making a watch. Apple is making a car. Apple is making a television set. Apple is making an espresso machine. Apple has gotten in a situation where everyone from users to investors has begun to expect them to be a hit-driven business. And, in part, they created that own image with the Mac, with the iPod, with the iPhone, with the iPad. And even though there were years, in some cases, more than a decade between those products, the mentality is now that Apple always needs the next best thing. Never mind competitors seldom, if ever, release new market-changing products. It's become expected that Apple will do it, and that expectation has mutated into Apple having to do that frequently. Never mind they have multi-billion-dollar businesses with Mac, with iPod, with iPhone, and iPad. Apple is doomed, I say, if they don't do the next thing all the time and now. And of course, the minute they do the next thing, we will ask, well, what's after that next thing? And the cycle will rinse and repeat. But for now, we have, once again, Apple iWatch rumors. And this time, it's Nick Bilton in the New York Times talking about it. And he's talking about a curved glass display. And his argument is that, well, first, he's heard, and actually a lot of people have heard by now, that Apple is experimenting with this. And frankly, if there is an area of popular technology that Apple wasn't experimenting with, I would be surprised. I would be flabbergasted, and I would be worried. Anything you hear about, from television sets to watches, it's fairly safe to assume someone at Apple has heard about them too, and a project, maybe a design, maybe even a prototype, or several, is underway deep in the vaults, but that is a far cry from a product. So that people have heard Apple is thinking about an iWatch is not in the least surprising. It would be surprising, nay, alarming, if they hadn't been thinking about it. So Bilton argues, and many people have said this before, that the technologies that Apple has deployed through iOS are starting to make a lot of sense in a device like a watch. For example, iOS on a 1.5-inch interface, if we go for something that looks like the previous generation iPod Nano, which many people hoped would become a watch, if you start to imagine iOS on that screen, it looks kind of limited. Maybe you get 2x2 icons, and you can tap your way through that, but it's not even an original iPhone-like screen, 3.5 inches. It's minimal real estate. But if you look at something like Siri, where you can do voice commands, then that starts to intermediate the needs of a physical graphical interface. The graphical interface becomes something secondary that you can use if you have to and want to, but the option to use Siri to kind of shortcut your way through it, just as you would gestures instead of buttons, becomes rather compelling. And yes, there are issues with Siri still, but assuming Apple at some point fixes those issues and it becomes a very fast, very reliable service, especially if there's a local connection, Bluetooth 4.0 or something between your watch and your phone or your tablet, that starts to become really interesting. Things like Notification Center, if notifications could come to your watch, if you don't want to pull your phone out of your pocket or your iPad out of your backpack or your man purse or your lady purse even, having notifications on your watch where you can just glance at them becomes interesting. And as much as people complain that Apple doesn't have widgets, Apple does indeed have widgets. iOS is full of widgets. They are just packed into Notification Center a little bit with weather and alarms, weather and stocks, but they are jam-packed into Siri. Siri will almost always present a widget of some type when you query Siri for data, and those widgets appearing on the iPhone or appearing on a secondary device like a watch doesn't seem like that far of a stretch, especially if iOS gains the ability to project interface elements separately from the device that it's running the core application on. That becomes a very interesting prospect. And because Apple has things like iMessage, which already are, when it works, are fairly device independent. Your iMessage shows up on your Mac, on your iPad, on your iPhone, on your iPod Touch. If iMessages start to work through there and you can respond through Siri, Maps, if Maps can start hooking into the data connection on your device, even download local areas onto your watch, so it's not continuously pulling data, but you can at least glance at your watch and see your location and see where you're going. It's easy to draw allusions to the nostalgia of Dick Tracy, or the concept of James Bond, the allure of James Bond, or of some future almost Star Trekian tapping the brooch on your pec to initiate a connection. It starts to become the sort of wearable technology that a lot of people are excited about. Now, whether watches is a major initiative from Apple, something like the iPhone or the iPad, where it's expected to sell hundreds of millions of devices at margin and make Apple a lot of money, or whether it's something like the Apple TV, which is a hobby, which is a string that they pull at, which is meant mostly at this stage to sort of enhance the overall value of the iOS ecosystem and not really have to make that much money on its own. If it's expected to sell in the single digits of millions, that's really uncertain. It's hard to tell what market there is for smartwatches. We've seen things like Motorola's Moto Active, I think it's called. We've seen the Pebble Watch. We've seen a few things in the space, but it's such early days that it's hard to tell exactly what demand there would be for a watch. A lot of people, myself included, have stopped wearing watches because we have a phone with us all the time, and it's not that difficult to reach into your pocket and pull out a phone. I mean, I would absolutely buy an iWatch the minute Apple offered one, if they ever offered one. But that's just because I would be interested in seeing what they did. I wouldn't necessarily buy a smartwatch from another company if I didn't have to. I do have a Pebble on order, but I'm just interested to see on what technology, sort of how they've managed to get it to work with iOS. An Apple solution obviously has all the allure that a first-party solution does. It would be best of breed. It would have the best interoperability, but the first thing people would ask for is apps, and my guess is it would be like an Apple TV to start, and it really wouldn't have apps. It would just have features pulled and projected from existing iOS devices. But would it do pedometer the way the iPod Nano does? Would it have greater health functions? Some people are hoping, guessing, wishing that it would do things like near field communications, or some version thereof using Bluetooth or something else to handle billing. That Passbook would come into its own with a device like this, where you could scan your watch instead of your phone. That when your watch came into proximity with your computer or with something else, it would automatically unlock them. Maybe you'd have a home automation system where it detects your watch the way it would detect your phone. But again, these aren't things that you couldn't do with the phone anyway. So it'll be really interesting to see if and when this progresses, and if and when Apple decides that it is a product or a hobby ready enough, the marketplace, the go-to-market strategy is valid enough for them to take it to market. So we'll have to keep watching the rumors for now and see. I also did an article with some more on the 5-inch iPhone. I originally put up an article about 2 weeks ago about the math behind a 5-inch iPhone, and that if Apple took the current iPhone display and scaled it up to close to 5 inches, it would coincidentally have the same pixels per inch, the same density as the iPad 4. So, right now Apple makes two device display densities. They have the 326 pixel per inch of the iPhone and the iPad mini, and they have the 264 pixels per inch of the iPad. So right now the iPad comes in both resolutions. The iPad 4 comes in the lower density, the iPad mini in the higher density, but the iPhone only comes in the higher density, and it's not impossible to imagine that Apple would have one of each product. They would have an iPad in the higher and lower density, and an iPhone in the higher and lower density. So you would have the iPad low, the iPad mini high, the iPhone large low, and the iPhone high. It would just be one of each product and one of each density. So John Gruber of Daring Fireball weighed in, and he said from an operations standpoint, they'd be reusing components they are already familiar with. From a software standpoint, existing apps would just run and everything would just look bigger on the screen. And then Marco Arment came out with a very similar post. He did the math and on his own came out with a very similar conclusion and said that by keeping the pixel dimensions the same as the iPhone 5, no app changes would be necessary. Some people wrote to me though and said, but it would be too big. The way the iPad mini is to the iPad, where everything was shrunk down due to the pixel density, and some people think it's shrunk too much. It's too hard to use. The iPhone, the bigger iPhone would increase in size. It'd be 20% bigger. So every button, every bit of text, every interface element would be 20% bigger. And that might be too large. That might be comically large. I mean, if you have accessibility issues, if your site is not great, bigger might be better. I know a lot of people who find text and buttons and things on the current iPhone way too small, and they would like something bigger. But for an average user, it might be too big. So what I did was I made some mock-ups, and I'll put the link in the show notes. And if you click on these mock-ups, or actually if you tap on these mock-ups on your iPhone or your iPad mini, it'll bring up what the interface would look like scaled 20% larger. So you can see on your actual devices what the buttons would look like, what the text will look like, what every bit of interface would look like, and then you can decide for yourself. I find too often nowadays we argue about things on the internet without examples of them. And I spoke about that previously, about skeuomorphism and skins and themes. And I think this is the same thing. It's hard to say whether an interface is too small or too big unless you actually see it on a device. And I did the same thing for the iPad mini before that was released, based on hearing that it would be the same interface. So this is the reverse of that. This is the quote-unquote close to 5-inch iPhone, what it would look like on your current devices. And I did the home screen, I did the settings screen, and I did Tweetbot. And you can try those out. And then at the end of the day, Apple has not really bifurcated the iPhone lineup. You have older iPhones that stuck around, including now older iPhones with 3.5-inch screens instead of the current 4-inch screen. But Apple's never released two different size iPhones in the same year, two new versions, the way they have with the iPad 4 and the iPad mini last year. But that's a great example. Apple has done that with other product lines. You can buy an 11-inch and 13-inch MacBook Air. You can buy a 13-inch and 15-inch MacBook Pro, a 13-inch and 15-inch Retina MacBook Pro. So it's not unusual at all for Apple to have multiple device screen sizes in the lineup. And then ultimately, again, you would have a 4-inch iPhone at a 4-inch iPhone at the current 326 ppi. You'd have a 5-inch iPhone at the 264 ppi. Then you'd have the iPad mini at the 326 ppi, and the iPad 4 at the 264 ppi. So you just have 4 inches, 5 inches, 7.9 inches, 9.7 inches, and that would be the iOS device screen lineup. Now, I don't know if Apple will do this. I don't know when. Again, the same as the iWatch. It's something that, they probably have at least looked at, given how popular other large screen phones are from other manufacturers. But if and when they ever choose to go to market, if and when they decide that adding a larger screen would help them sell more devices, enough more devices that it'd be worth, bifurcating the lineup, then they'll do it. If they don't think that is valid to do that yet, they'll wait and maybe do it at some point in the future. But I think, again, looking at it in terms of how the interface looks and what their options are and what makes sense with components, because Apple, they have to obey the laws of physics, they have to obey the laws of economics. They don't live in a vacuum. So looking at it that way, I think makes a lot of sense, absent really solid, information like case leaks or, Apple actually holding the thing up on stage. So the less expensive iPhone is the other device that's getting a lot of attention. And we talked previously about, maybe it'll be like the iPhone 5, only with a less expensive components. And I used the example of, with the iPod. Apple made the iPod, and then they made the iPod mini, which became the iPod Nano. And that's very similar to making the iPad and then the iPad mini. But then underneath the Nano, you also have the Shuffle, where they just took out the screen. Underneath the iMac, you have the Mac Mini, where they just took away the screen. Now, obviously, Apple's not going to take away the screen from iOS devices, but they can do other things. They can make them smaller, like they did with the iPad and the iPod Mini. And they can also use less expensive components. There might be less memory in it, or they might use a plastic casing instead of a unibody aluminum casing. And maybe the radio won't be as advanced a chipset, or maybe the CPU won't be as modern. Maybe it won't be an A7 or whatever is next, but it'll be an A6 or an A5 something. There's all these things Apple can do to lower the cost of materials so that it's less expensive to make the device. And yes, people say Apple already has a $0 iPhone. It's the iPhone 4 on AT&T and Verizon, but that's a first world problem, literally a first world problem, because of the way that carriers work in North America. You can get a subsidized phone for $0. But as we discussed before, that phone costs $450 off contract. And there are parts of the world where that is a significant enough amount of money as to make it a deal breaker. Now, if Apple, reports came out this week that Apple is up 400% in sales in India, and there's rumors that Apple's in discussion with China Mobile, the largest carrier in the world. Carriers so large that they would create enormous new markets in emerging markets for Apple. And if Apple had a less expensive offering, they would be able to approach an entirely bigger, they have a much bigger addressable market. There'd be much more people to buy an iPhone that was less expensive, whether it's $350 or $250 off contract. Whatever Apple can release can lower that price down to. And again, it wouldn't be cheaper. It wouldn't be a crappy product. Apple doesn't make crappy products. Instead of a cheapy netbook made out of cheapy parts that really sucked, Apple made the MacBook Air and the iPad. Instead of a cheapy, crappy music player, they made the iPod Nano and eventually the iPod Shuffle. So Apple knows how to make high quality but less expensive products. And if they applied the same thing to the iPhone, you could conceivably see a lower cost product hitting the market that still had tremendously good build quality, an Apple-like product that simply didn't cost as much. And there's an additional advantage to this, and I was discussing it with Arnold Kim from Mac Rumors at Macworld quite a bit, because one of the things that Apple's facing now is that their products are becoming really, really good. As much as the BS that went around with the iPhone 5 saying it wasn't innovative and it was boring, the iPhone 5 was completely redesigned and rebuilt. It is an aluminum unibody. It's got an in-cell display. It is a fantastic piece. It is manufacturing porn. Machinists look at that thing with mouths agape at how Apple is putting them together. And right now, the iPhone 4 is good enough that it is selling in large numbers. It looks like the iPhone 4, and to some extent the iPhone 4S, are selling well enough that it is lowering Apple's average sale price for the iPhone. When you look at their last conference call, the average selling price of the iPhone is down, and that seems to be because of the iPhone 4 and iPhone 4S in the mix. People are looking at them and saying, oh, for $0 I can have an iPhone 4, for $100 I can have an iPhone 4S, and those are pretty damn good phones. And what's going to happen is, if Apple sticks to pattern, this year the iPhone 5 goes to $100. Next year the iPhone 5 goes to $0. And we're living in a North American market where the iPhone 5, which in 2 years is still going to be a fantastic piece and an expensive piece of engineering, is $0, competing with the iPhone 6 or the iPhone 6S or whatever Apple is selling as the flagship device by then. And that puts pressure on the average sales price. People go into a store, and yes, it's only $100 or $200 difference, but the quality of the low-end model becomes so good that more and more people choose to go with that free or that cheap option, and Apple's profits suffer. But if Apple has this lower-cost device that they're selling on emerging markets, and it's differentiated enough, it's plastic, but it's color, it's everything to the iPhone, what the lower-end iPods are to that lineup, then maybe people who can afford the flagship iPhone get that instead. They want the metal, they want the high quality. There's a much, not a very large, but a much larger difference between the cheap option and the premium option. And then maybe Apple's making more money, higher margin off the lower price model, and they get more people in premium markets to buy the premium model. And that is kind of the best of both worlds for them. They satisfy a much larger range of demand because they have the lower cost offering for those who want it, but they're not cannibalizing as many people from their premium market. Now, this again is complete speculation. But if Apple is thinking about lower cost iPhones, and again, I would be scared if Apple wasn't at least thinking about it, given, how big emerging markets are and how heavily Apple is emphasizing China and, what they're doing in India right now and what they've mentioned they want for Russia and Brazil. It only makes sense that there's at least conversations, if not more, about these kinds of devices. And they do make sense when you break down Apple's business and where it'll be in a year, 2 years, 5 years down the road. It does make sense that, maybe these sorts of devices are something that we will see at some point. So that's the less expensive iPhone. I put up another article. I mean, I spoke quickly about this before, but when I was traveling to Macworld, I got caught in the freezing rainstorms in Canada. That's above the wall for everyone in the U.S. And it took me forever to get my first plane to Toronto, and then ended up being stuck in Toronto for 8 hours. It took me, I think, 19 hours overall to get from Montreal to San Francisco. And while I had two Mophie power station duos with me, I forgot all my lightning cables at home. So by the time I got to Toronto, my iPhone was at about 20%, and I really needed that iPhone for when I got to San Francisco. I checked out the iStore, which is like this airport electronics store. I checked out the Best Buy vending machines, and yes, that is really weird that Best Buy has vending machines, and there were no lightning cables available, so there was no way for me to recharge my iPhone. And the reason I needed it is that to use an iPad data plan in the US, it's $1 a megabyte. It is so expensive that I would never, ever, not ever turn it on. It is pennies per megabyte to use my iPhone there. So I needed to save my iPhone when I got to San Francisco. But I was still in Toronto, which meant that I had LTE on my iPad mini. So I ended up using my iPad mini as a phone. It kind of just happened by accident. I was using my iPhone. I got nervous about the battery drain. And because the 3G, it wasn't even LTE at Pearson Airport, the 3G was so bad, it was draining fast. It was draining almost AT&T fast. So I just turned it off and stuck it in my pocket. And I got an iMessage on my iPad mini, and I realized, I have this iPad mini with me. So I started walking around the airport holding the iPad mini in one hand the way I would an iPhone, the way I never could a full-size iPad because it's simply too big to hold in a usable fashion in just one hand. And I walked around with it. I was playing letterpress. I was sending iMessages. I placed calls on Skype. I even received calls on Skype. Skype is a bit of a battery drain, so I probably should have used FaceTime, but Skype worked fine for what I was using it for. And I stood in line at restaurants. I stood in line at coffee shops. I stood in line at customer service, using the iPad mini as a phone. And I had a headset, an in-ear headset that I would use for my iPhone as well, mostly listening to podcasts and audiobooks, but I used that to place calls because I didn't want the iPad mini like a 1980s boombox on the side of my head. But it worked perfectly well, and because the battery is a beast on the iPad mini, after about 8 hours of use, it was still at 30%, which is great. So I was very happy with it. I know a lot of people, I think on MacBreak Weekly, Leo Laporte has just asked for a phone.app on his iPad mini. And to me, it's not ideal because the 4:3 aspect ratio is a bit square for a phone. But I can see a lot of people, and we had a lot of people in the comments for the article saying that that's what they want to do. They want to get rid of their phone, just have a data plan on their iPad mini. It'll save them money. It's still a really good size. You can put it in the back pocket of not of your skinny hipster jeans, but of your baggy whatever jeans, or you can put it in your winter coat in Canada, or it is much more portable than the big boy iPad. So that is fairly interesting, and it's not something that I'm going to do now that I have my iPhone recharged, but it is something that I would never have done with the old iPad. So if you've tried it, let me know what you think, but it was absolutely a viable option. And yeah, it does make the Galaxy Note 2 and even that silly 6-inch phablet that they showed off at CES look small by comparison. But if you have a tablet and you only want a tablet, you don't want a phone, if you barely ever use the phone on your iPhone, then it is an alternative for you to look at. So I'll put a link again to that article in there. The next thing I want to talk about a little bit is Dropbox and iCloud. Dropbox announced a new API this week that will make it easier for developers to integrate Dropbox into their app. I don't know how widely known it is, but Dropbox has been, in some occasions has been a real pain in the ass for developers, especially developers outside the US, because Dropbox uses Amazon S3, and we don't think about it a lot, but Amazon S3 is mostly a US thing. It's not as well spread out across the world. A lot of big online services are like that because they were primarily located in the US to begin with. But even absent international concerns, it has been a pain for some developers to integrate Dropbox, and the new API makes it easier. I spoke to a few developers, like Justin from Elements, which is the Dropbox text editor, Markdown text editor, and Dennis from Readle, which makes a lot of Dropbox-enabled PDF and document apps. And most of the developers I spoke to have said that the new API is interesting and they will probably use it going forward, or they might use it going forward, but they've already engineered their way around Dropbox. So they're not going to go back and retrofit it into existing apps. They've solved that problem already. No matter how ugly it was, they've done it, and there's no reason to go back and do it over again with the newer, easier API. But it got me thinking, and I've been thinking about iCloud a lot lately. And we did that panel at Macworld that Lex Friedman hosted with John Gruber from Daring Fireball, Matthew Panzerino from The Next Web, and Paul Kafisis from Rogue Amoeba. And we spoke a bit about iCloud. And iCloud is something to me that is the right idea. It's meant to be ubiquitous. It's meant to just be all your stuff in a way that you don't have to worry about it. It just works in the background. And Apple was very careful not to call it sync. They said that it would, Steve Jobs said that it would store all your stuff on the cloud and push it down to all your devices. And that included iOS devices, Windows, and Macs. And you wouldn't have to worry about file systems, about folders, about hierarchies. You would just open an app, write a document, iCloud would save it, and as soon as you go back to that app, the document would just be there. But to me, there's a couple fundamental problems with the way that iCloud works right now. The first one is that app dependency. iCloud is completely bound to your apps right now. So let's say you have Text Editor 1, and you create a document in it. You now not only have to remember the document you created, but you have to remember the app you created it in, because in order to get back to that document, the only way you can do that is through the app. So I have to remember that, my shopping list is in Text Editor 1. Now let's say, I'm surfing the App Store, I'm looking at a blog, and I see, oh, amazing, best ever, new Text Editor 2. So I hit that, and I'm not, whether I'm an expert user or not, I hit that, I download the app, and now I'm using Text Editor 2. But none of my older files are there because they're bound to Text Editor 1. So now either I have to laboriously copy and paste every single document from Text Editor 1 to Text Editor 2, or I have to now remember which documents are in Text Editor 1 and which documents are in Text Editor 2, or I have to check both apps if I don't remember. So the cognitive overhead starts to get bigger and bigger. Let's say that happens again with Text Editor 3. Let's say I get a new device and I only install Text Editor 2 or Text Editor 3, and I still have documents stuck in Text Editor 1. I now have to keep all three apps around or go back and reinstall the app when I want to get to those documents. And that's only for text documents. If you start adding all the different kinds of documents that are stored in iCloud together, it just becomes silly. It becomes silly at a certain point. So I would really like for documents to become unbound to apps. I would just like iCloud to present any document that an app can open. So for example, if I open Text Editor anything, any document, whether it's Markdown or plain text or HTML, anything that contains just pure text, iCloud just shows that to the app. So the app just has a list of everything that app can open. And I tap it and I go. And if I open another text editor, the exact same content is displayed. I don't want to have the memory of all that stuff. I don't want to have that cognitive overhead. I want iCloud to do that heavy lifting. So any app can pull all the documents that it can open, and iCloud pushes all the documents that can be opened to apps that can open them. And that, to me, it makes a lot more sense, especially as iCloud scales. The other problem is that iCloud is still rough. The iCloud APIs are still rough. If you listen to enough developers talk about it, key value store works-ish, but things like documents take a lot of effort. And several really famous, well-known developers have just abandoned it at this point because it's not working great. And services have never been a strength at Apple. And some people would argue that, iCloud Mail, stuff like that works. And yeah, it works now. It didn't work so great when it was MobileMe and .Mac before that, but Apple's gotten better at it. And Apple will keep getting better at it. But right now, it's not bulletproof. It's not fantastic. Yes, Google goes down, Amazon goes down, everybody goes down. But the feeling is that iCloud isn't yet reliable enough for these developers to use. And that's a shame because I want everybody using it. So along with all the other stuff Apple has to work on with Maps and Siri and Game Center and whatnot, just nailing the iCloud APIs, making them so rock solid and easy to implement that it's a no-brainer for every developer to use them. We're going to still not quite be there in terms of this iCloud future. And that's a future I really want because I think iCloud has the right idea. And that's in contrast to Dropbox. I mean, Dropbox is fantastic. I've been using Dropbox for years. We have an enterprise Dropbox account at Mobile Nation. So I have tons of Dropbox space. My entire documents folder from my Mac lives in Dropbox. So all my documents are on all my computers. Every time I install a new computer, Dropbox is the first thing that I install. I live in Dropbox. But that's because I'm a traditional computer user. I'm used to file systems. And at the end of the day, that's what Dropbox is. It's a folder sync. It takes files, it replicates hierarchies, and it just copies everything from one folder to another folder and everything in that hierarchy to everything in every computer's hierarchy. And that's old world thinking. That's not what the future of file systems, in my opinion, should be. That's not something, for example, my mother has Dropbox, and to her it's as frustrating as the local file system on her Mac because she never knows where stuff should go or where she saved it or where she put it. It's an organizational mess. And just like, my mom shouldn't have to worry about a manual car. She shouldn't have to be a mechanic to drive a car. And cars have evolved so that so that she doesn't have to be anymore. They have automatic transitions and cruise control, and they'll park themselves, and they'll even come find you in parking lots if CES is to be believed. That same thing is happening with computers. The heavy lifting, the hard work, the memory intensive stuff should be done by the computer. So Dropbox is absolutely brilliant at doing what it does, but what it does is something of the past. It's the wrong thing. It's not the thing that we need next. Now, Steve Streza from Pocket did a great rebuttal to my post on this, and I'll put both links in the show notes, where he said that, that's a UI issue, that you could present Dropbox with or without a traditional hierarchical file system, so it doesn't really matter. And yeah, that's true to a certain extent. To a user, though, the interface is the application. What you look at is what it does. And Dropbox at its core is that file system. It's just dumping stuff on Amazon S3. And maybe it could work the way iCloud does, but it's still, for a lot of people, that file system. And I don't want that. I want documents to just save. I want them to be in this giant flat soup that I can search through. I want them to intelligently show themselves in the applications that can use them. So iCloud to me is what's next. I think Apple has the right idea. It's just not implemented right yet. So I find myself stuck in between the Dropbox that was and is, the best thing ever at what computers used to be, and iCloud, which is what computers should be, but just doesn't work properly yet. And it gets to this core of this thing that I was talking about at that panel, that yes, power users will suffer through this. It will be painful. It will be turbulence. And we're not going to like it. But that's fine because we are relics. We are dinosaurs. We are people who grew up doing this stuff that no one should have to do. We are the people who had to be mechanics to drive cars. And we resent that new users aren't mechanics and are driving these cars. but they are the future. The mainstream are the future. It's like an X-Men. We're the future, Charles, not them. They no longer matter. We're the ones who no longer matter. Our needs no longer matter. Apple is not concerned with power users. They are concerned with empowering users. They don't necessarily care what we do because we can take care of ourselves. We're very good at it. We learned the hard way. We've been writing BASIC since the Apple II. They care about non-tech savvy users, the people who used to buy beige boxes at Best Buy and not have any idea what to do with them and would call us. They'd call their neighbors and friends and complain and feel intimidated and off-put and scared. And again, I keep using my mom as an example, but she's a great example. She kept getting viruses on her Windows computer because of PDF files, so I gave her a Mac, and that took care of the virus problem. But she didn't understand, like, why is my internet gone? Oh, it's not. It's just behind Word. It's different windows. And where did I save this file? Oh, you put it in this folder. No, I didn't. Well, that's where you were last were when you saved it. And now that she's had an iPad, the day after we got her an iPad, she had been complaining that her newspaper wasn't arriving on time. And the day after we bought her an iPad for her birthday, we asked her about her newspaper, and she said, "Oh, who cares? I'm reading my newspaper on my iPad." And I've had to do virtually no tech support. She presses the home button, she launches an app, she goes to the App Store, she buys an app. It has made her a power user, not in the same way that I'm a power user, sitting in Photoshop or Final Cut Pro or in Terminal, but it has enabled her to do so much more with a computing device than she could ever do with OS X or Windows, that it's literally night and day. And that is what Apple is accomplishing, and that is what they are working towards, and that is what their priority is. And if you look at it detached, if you're not a traditional user and you don't take it personally, that's what Apple should be doing. That's what Apple has relentlessly done since the Apple II. They made the Macintosh, they made the iPad, they've done everything they can to democratize computing and make it easier to use. And that's what iCloud should be for the cloud. iCloud should be to the cloud what the iPad is to the Mac. And we're just not there yet, but I really hope we get there because I do think it's the right idea. So, the last thing I want to talk about is retention. And by retention, I mean Apple employee retention. About 10 months ago, Guy English, who's my co-host on Debug, he likely ingested too much melange and had a prescient moment and wrote a really good article about the problems facing Apple in the future. And third among them was people. And this is what he said. It's been maybe 3 years since the team that had defined what we now know as iOS were granted stock options. Look at their share price then and look at the share price now. Ultimately, the retention of talent will be Apple's Achilles heel. John Gruber said that maybe that should have been the first point because, as Dan Frommer noted on Twitter, this is not at all a scientific study, but most of the Apple employees I follow on Twitter have quit within the last 9 months. And I don't want to get into their personal lives or their personal details or name a list, but I've seen the same thing. There's a large percentage of Apple people that I followed who are now no longer at Apple, and there were quite a few this week, which has brought it to attention again. Now, Justin Reed, who himself was an Apple employee, he framed it this way. He said, Apple was a village that became a city overnight, and village folk don't necessarily like living in cities. And Guy made this point 10 months ago too. It's that for the people who worked on iOS, they've done it now. They invented the future. They revolutionized the phone and the tablet. They did something spectacular, something universe-denting. And now it's just basically, I don't want to say maintenance mode because there's still innovation that'll happen, but the big work is done. The new thing has been done. And these people, they kind of crave an adventure. So when you've made the next, the current big thing, when you've made the money that comes with being at the beginning of the current best thing, and when the world around you has grown from something secret and small to something really big and really well known, you might just decide to, cash out, pack your bags, pack your fortunes, and go off in search of the next adventure. And Gruber said that it's not an exodus, and it's not because as many people as I follow who've left Apple, a bunch of really smart and talented people that I follow have also joined Apple recently. Apple is hiring some really phenomenally talented people. And if you look at what Tim Cook did with Eddie Q and Johnny Ive and Craig Federighi and Bob Mansfield, where he reorganized Apple into that software services, technology, and hardware model. Software services design and technology model. That's sort of a revolution inside Apple. You no longer have the voice of Steve Jobs drowning everything out. So you have room for these, I don't know the right way to put it, but it's not really a changing of the guard because most of these people have been there for a very long time, but there is some sort of new direction, new way of looking at things. And, maybe there is fresh talent coming in, and with that, fresh ideas. And that could even help Apple with what comes next. Because after a while, once you've done the big thing, you're trapped by that big thing. You have so much of an investment in it that it's sort of hard to push it to the next level. And rather than go, hire someone who makes sugary water to take over marketing your company, it makes much more sense to find the very best people you can who are using the tools that you've designed to make fantastic things on their own and sort of bring them in to the company. Now, it's, previously to revolutionize, to take OS 9 and make OS 10, Apple just bought next. They bought Steve Jobs. And it's hard to see Apple making an acquisition, small startup or giant next acquisition that would do the same thing for their services and the next generation stuff. So getting these new people in, even if some old people leave, it does sort of accomplish that. It brings those new ideas to the table. So I'm really sad to see some of these people go, but I'm really excited to see some of what these new people do. And the Tim Cook era is not the Steve Jobs era, but it's too soon to tell what that means. And it could mean something, and I've said this before, that, Steve Jobs was an auteur. He had spectacular success with things like the iPhone and iPad. And, he had the G4 Cube, and he had the iPod Hi-Fi, and he had, Mobile Me. There were some bad ideas and good ideas in there. And with Tim Cook, it might be normalized. The highs might be not as high, but the lows might be not as low. And I'm really interested to see where Apple goes with that. So, it's something to keep an eye on, especially for people who are really enthusiastic about Apple, but it's something to keep an eye on both in terms of, what is happening there and in terms of, what's happening there. It's as exciting as it is scary. So I wish everyone leaving Apple good luck, and I wish everyone coming to Apple good luck. And I really want to see what we get as we start approaching the summer and, presumably iOS 7 and the next generation of devices. So that is it for tonight. If you haven't already, please head on over to iTunes. Please leave a rating. Please leave a review. It encourages iTunes to feature us, and that means we get to reach even more phenomenal people like you. You can follow me at Rene Ritchie on Twitter and ADN. You can follow all of us at iMore. You can follow all of us at iMore for all of our shows, including Iterate, where Mark Edwards, Seth Clifford, and I interview a lot of great designers, and Debug, where Guy English and I interview a lot of fantastic developers. For all of those shows and more, just go to mobilenations.com/shows. Thank you very much for joining us, and I will see you next week.